Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books Presents Online. Douglas Boin and Lorri Glover discussing Alaric the Goth. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore, celebrating 51 years this year. We would love to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Douglas and Lorri, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books, with curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We do staff recommendations to whomever would like them as well. So if you want to give us a call or check out our website for some of our staff picks, we would be more than happy to help. And we are incredibly happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Douglas Boin and Lorri Glover and Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or all of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. It is very important now to support local, and we thank you all so much for your support. It also helps us keep this event series going. So if you enjoy this series, you can make a donation to the Left Bank Books Foundation, or you can support us by buying more books. So thank you. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And now for tonight's book. Denied citizenship by the Roman Empire, a soldier named Alaric changed history by unleashing a surprise attack on the capital city of an unjust empire. Stigmatized and relegated to the margins of Roman society, the Goths were violent barbarians who destroyed civilization, at least in the conventional story of Rome's collapse. I guess I should do quotation marks as well. But a slight shift of perspective brings their history and ours shockingly alive. Alaric grew up near the river border that separated Gothic territory from Roman. He survived a border policy that separated migrant children from their parents, and he was denied benefits he likely expected from military service. Romans were deeply conflicted over who should enjoy the privileges of citizenship. They wanted to buttress their global power, but were insecure about Roman identity. They depended on foreign goods, but scoffed at and denied foreigners their own voices and humanity. In stark contrast to the rising bigotry, intolerance, and zealotry among Romans during Alaric's lifetime, the Goths, as practicing Christians, valued religious pluralism and tolerance. The marginalized Goths, marked by history as frightening harbingers of destruction and of the Dark Ages, preserved virtues of the ancient world that we take for granted. The 3 nights of riots Alaric and the Goths brought to the capital struck fear into the hearts of the powerful, but the riots were not without cause. Combining vivid storytelling and historical analysis, Douglas Boin reveals the Goths' complex and fascinating legacy in shaping our world. Tom Holland, the author of Rubicon, The Last Years of the Roman Republic, says, "A remarkable feat of historical alchemy, a transmutation of the scanty and inadequate sources into the gold of a gripping narrative." And Tim Whitmarsh, the author of Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World, says, "A brilliantly readable account of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which for the first time spotlights not the Romans, but the Gothic invader Alaric." This is a story for our own age, too. Douglas Boin asks us to take seriously the question of what would have happened if the tottering city of Rome had prioritized inclusive citizenship over paranoia and conflict, if it had built bridges rather than walls. This is urgent, gravid history, which will be read by anyone interested in empire, cultural conflict, and the making of the modern narrative of the West. Douglas Boin is a professor of history at St. Louis University and author of Coming Out Christian in the Roman World, and 2 scholarly books on antiquity. From fall 2019 to fall 2020, he is serving as a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin. And tonight, Douglas will be in conversation with Lorri Glover. Lorri is an American scholar who holds the John Francis Bannon Endowed Chair in the Department of History at St. Louis University. She specializes in the social history of the English colonies and the creation of the American Republic. She is the author of the recently released Eliza Lucas Pinckney, An Independent Woman in the Age of Revolution. And now I am very happy and pleased to be able to welcome Douglas Boin and Lorri Glover for Left Bank Books. If everyone at home would please give them a round of applause as I welcome them to the screen. All right. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Yes, thank you for having us. It's great to see Doug from across the miles. We work together, but we haven't been able to see each other in some time.
It has been a while. I was down here all of last year, and then coronavirus made it kind of too difficult to leave the state. I do have to reiterate just at the start what Shane said about supporting the bookstore. I love Left Bank Books. I love independent bookstores and local businesses in general. So this is going to totally sound canned, but it's not. Like, I didn't prepare this in any way. If not my book, order Lorri's, or if not one of ours, get your favorite fiction. Just support the bookstore in some way. Pay this forward, if not this event, so that the events can keep happening. Authors appreciate it, but the booksellers completely, they need us, and St. Louis needs Left Bank Books.
Thank you. All right. Well, I will let you have.
Well, let's dive in, Doug, because I know listeners are eager to hear about the book, and maybe let's just start with the fact that this is a quite different project than the other books you've written. It's the first time you've written a biography, and so how did you arrive at the retelling of this particular story, and how did you decide on a biographical approach?
So I guess the first thing to say is I like projects with high degree of difficulties. I think that's just kind of naturally where my instincts go to as a writer. If you tell me that nothing exists for a topic or a source, or that a person's life is hidden, then I'm going to want to try to find that person's life. I think the challenge of working in the archive, the challenge of doing history, is finding the stuff you need to document what you're doing. And for me, Alaric just seemed the perfect person to try to move from the realm of fiction into a kind of more substantial, fully realized biography. Because there's only been, you go to the bookshelf and if you are looking for an Alaric the Goth, you'll find one maybe from 1930. It's a English translation of a French novel that Marcel Brion wrote. It's wildly creative, which is to say, like, sometimes untethered to anything historical. But that's it. Like, Alaric did not have anything else on the shelf. And I felt like, maybe we can get into this next, I just felt like he was the right person for right now.
Well, I do want to talk about right now and the connection between ancient Rome and 21st century America. There's so many things I loved about this book, Doug. On the one hand, you immerse us in this really foreign, distant place, and we get the sights and the smells and the sounds and the flavor. You talk about food in the book, among other things. So we're really immersed in a very different world, but at the same time, you're able to show the connections between ancient Rome and 21st century America. And I wondered how much of the present was intentionally shaping what you're writing about the past.
Yeah, I think, as the ancient history is not what people instinctively go to pick up to learn about their world. I think if you asked people what what does history do at its best? They would tell you, provides us a set of events and context for understanding our world. Like, I think that's certainly on the street right now in our social media conversations and our conversations with our family. We want to go back and re-understand how we got here. And I think it's always hard, especially when you're dealing with something overseas, and when you're dealing with something overseas deep back in time, that sense of, why should I care how to inform me, just instinctively replaces the immediate curiosity or the immediate sense that that there might be something satisfying about taking this exploration. So I wasn't necessarily driven by concerns of like what's happening in the news. Meaning like in 2015, 2016, when I was writing this, I wasn't necessarily looking over my shoulder every day or looking at the internet every day saying like, how do I translate, this headline into this story? I think how I got to this story was simply being present minded. And if I can just kind of explain, what I mean by that, the origins of the story came from something I was reading in the New York Times in 2015, but it was a profile of that featured Charles Dickens. And I read a lot. Like I'm the historian who just insatiably can't stop reading. Like I've done that since I was 10. And so I was reading this profile. It was Charles Dickens coming to America, and he was touring Ohio, and he was touring the Great Lakes, and he was incredibly just dismissive of the literary sensibilities and the cultural sophistication of the people that he was encountering, which is not surprising for kind of British kind of paragon of elite education. But he just said, like, I went to this different part of the globe. This is what got me. Very smart person goes to a different part of the globe and doesn't understand how to talk to the people there, and certainly doesn't expect the people there to contribute anything to his education. And for me, that was what inspired this story, because Charles Dickens was visiting Toni Morrison's birth town, even though he couldn't know that. And the story in the New York Times is a profile of Toni Morrison, like one of America's most amazing writers and contributor to our literary culture. And for me, I was thinking about how do you, that's it. Like the world of Rome can be very parochial. What starts in Rome stops in Rome, and then you go to the Middle Ages and you go to the modern period, and nothing ever seems to connect anything to why it could be relevant, why it could matter. But if you take the idea of Rome, sorry, I have a pencil, I'm gesturing here. If you take the idea of Rome and then think, well, what was life like outside it? What happened when the globe expanded so much that someone from Rome went to the Danube River, and did they not think anything could ever come from the Danube River, and that the world might not actually just pivot entirely to be focused on that part of the globe? That Alec grew up on the border, and no one ever expected his people to become anything, but they became the bridge between antiquity and the periods of history that came after it. And so kind of in that moment, I wasn't trying to capture a headline, because it wasn't the headline. It was just a profile of a person, and how one person can overlook, from a kind of cultural supremacist way, an entire civilization, an entire kind of culture. And I knew at that point that's what fired the story. The story was, go right this wrong, go do justice to people who have never honestly had their version of history told.
So for people who have not read the book and should get a copy and read it, I want to double back a little bit to some of the things that I saw connect, or that I thought I saw connecting ancient Rome to modern America. So I learned a lot about ancient Rome. And I feel like I could see the walls and the gates from your description. But then I also learned about a society, with growing xenophobia, with political and religious driven violence, with cultural arrogance, with the narrowing of notions of who could and couldn't be worthy of citizenship, rumors about rising criminality. There's even like violence and border patrol violence and apocalyptic thinking. And I thought I saw a character that seemed like Obama. And so I just was so struck by how familiar it was, and how, what do they say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. And the rhythm of what happened to Rome in that critical period, and where we are in a critical period today, was I couldn't stop thinking about it.
I mean, so that's so like, it's just fascinating for me to hear, first of all, because that any of it leapt off the page and inspired these kind of thoughts and these impressions, because so much, I think, of how Rome can often be presented, or how any history can be presented, is just, here are my facts, here's my laundry list, or kind of, laundry clothesline of events, and what's missing is like the emotional glue, or the kind of the tones and the notes that would allow people to say, like, oh, this emperor who came from the provinces, that was laughed out of his administration because he was said to have gotten his job by luck and not by talent, and then had all of the kind of hurtful slurs sent at him because he didn't speak Latin the right way. Like, it's not as if, I think, the process of making one-to-one analogy between then and now has to like happen. That certainly wasn't what I was interested in. But like, I wanted to tap into that sense of, we know what disgust is, and we know what unfairness is, and we know when someone's being given a raw deal. And it's important, I think, in establishing kind of a person's place in ancient Rome from a reader's point of view, to know that those challenges were there too, for emperors from the provinces, for chariot drivers, for athletes. Like, this is a story about people, and Alaric is just one of them. But trying to find the team that could kind of bring his world to life, so to speak, meant being attuned to this whole cast of characters, and to see, to make them three-dimensional. They're not, they have hopes, they have aspirations, they are, their assassination is a moment of incredible uncertainty for society. Like, those moments needed to be brought out for the world to come alive. So I focused on that.
So you did an incredible amount of what I would call historical detective work. And you relook again at, you mentioned, in some history, it's just like, here are the facts. And you were willing to pick up, supposed facts and turn them a different direction, and be able to tell a very different kind of story. I mean, you're piecing together all kinds of different evidence, and the story is, the book is seamless, and so it looks easy, but it must have been, it must have been extraordinarily difficult. So what were some of the biggest challenges in recreating this story of the siege of Rome?
Yeah, there were ups and downs, and there were moments my editor was gonna strangle me for all of the torture that it was unleashing upon my early readers. Like, it just not like, I'm thankful that you said that it is seamless, because that's, the little, I guess, like little hat tip to the way the trade works here, but like that's the result of 45 revisions. I'm like, and I'm not lying, like I'm pretty sure that just from start to finish, I go through that level of rewrite, because it needs to sound, to me, it just needs to sound right. And unless it sounds right, it's not right. The things that were challenging were his childhood, because no one was there and no one cared about him until he became about 20. When he's 20, the very first inkling in the Roman sources is clear. He shows up in 1.5 lines of Latin poetry. And we hear about he tried to overturn a chariot that was the emperor's postal service in the marshes of Macedonia. That's it. I've probably embellished it. Like that's the extent to which you can find information about Alaric's childhood. So how do you fill the first 3 chapters of the book? Other histories would just start there, and they would say, well, we can't know, and then they would go on. And I just don't, like, my commitment is to the reader. My commitment is to the community of people who have given me so much delight in providing me books that allow me to kind of go to faraway places, all throughout my life. It's to writers and to readers. So it's not satisfying to me to say, okay, well, there's nothing about his childhood. What can I fill in about a hypothetical Gothic childhood that would help make sense of who Alaric became? And for me, that was one of the most challenging, but it was also one of the most rewarding, because it meant looking at evidence that I'm just not, that I wasn't expecting to find answers in. And so, there's a very famous text. Everyone who works on this period knows it. It's called The History of the Goths, and it's written by the 6th century Latin writer named Jordan. And he lived in the 6th century. He spoke Latin. He understood his Gothic heritage, but this book that he put together was like any origin story, like, Jill Lepore's These Truths. It's can be compendious, and unlike the more kind of sophisticated modern practitioners of history, Jordan just kind of made things up when he didn't know them. So the Goths, to him, fought at the Trojan War. They were, friends with Alexander the Great. They, descended from Amazons. Like, he just pulled at straws to come up with an origin story for the Goths. And so most people read Jordan today and they're like, you can't really trust it if he's talking about history. But when I went back and I read it. It was the very first thing I read, because I just needed to immerse myself in the material. He had all of these wonderful descriptions of the natural landscape. And he would talk about rivers, and he would talk about trees, and he would talk about the birds and the fauna that were found along the borders of Gothia. And he would talk about which rivers were 2 days or 3 days journey out. And he would differentiate, different types of deer from one another. And when I went back to that text thinking of childhood, all of a sudden I found Alaric's childhood in the natural world. And that was kind of like, oh, this is what school would have been. This is where the classroom was. This is how a child gained knowledge about his larger world. And so from there, it was an easy step to, can I find archaeological evidence that might fill in some of the gap here? And then you get into bones and what bones have been found at excavation, and it starts to kind of match up. And so you get that historian's kind of like, moment of satisfaction, where it's, I've found corroborating evidence to something that I thought was the case. So for me, Alaric's childhood was really the most challenging, because there was nothing. We can't go to Pine Tree Island and see his house. I wish, we could all take the people would be traipsing across the landscape of the Danube to go see Alaric's house. But it's not there. So I had to be creative, and I hope that it worked.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think worked for your credibility extraordinarily well is there were moments that you would, present the evidence to the reader and walk through the choices you had to make about what parts of the evidence to use and what had credibility and what had less credibility and what had been dismissed by earlier or other scholars and what was worthy of reconsideration. And so, that I thought was extraordinarily skillful, that you could do that and not lose your central story.
I mean, that's super for you to like, I'm just smiling, like, I'm huge grin hearing you say that, because you're right. The risk is like, every academic book is like that. Every academic book is like, I'm going to start with a fact, and by the end of chapter 3, like, everything is contested. Like, every sentence, every word is contested, and it's like, at that point, you don't even have a story anymore. So and especially when you're dealing with something 2,000 years old, like, I had to be both incredibly humble to go back and say, like, lots of people have looked at this before, but also, willfully foolish to kind of say, like, I'm going to put my own spin on it. But the story was really the most important thing. I always would come back to, where is Alaric now? And then how can I keep the story going? But I like the fact that there's a room for these kind of digressions about craft, because I feel like that makes the book, it gives you could do a historical fiction of Alaric, and I'm jealous of fiction writers. Like, I am jealous of their creativity. I'm jealous of the way they use language. I'm jealous of the inventiveness of the plots. Like, everything across the board, I'm jealous of fiction writers. But, like, this book needed to be analytical in a way that a novel is not a work of analysis. And so the story is the hook, but I hope that the substance of it is historical, in that we get a better appreciation for what happened, why, and how we know that.
So, what was your relationship with Alaric? How did you think about it? And what is your responsibility to him as a writer, and him the subject, and did it change over time?
I think what captured me about him most throughout the entire process, and I knew this going in, was he's a man of contradictions. And I don't think there's any, like, from Eliza Pinckney, like, I don't think anything more fascinating than a person who is just a walking bundle of contradictions, whether they live in a world in which, there's just, he was an immigrant, crossed the border. His first act is to try to take out an imperial carriage. And yet, within 12 months, 18 months, we know he's enlisted in the Roman army, and he's serving the emperor that he just tried to assassinate. Like, that moment when he appears in the historical stage, the historical record, is so mind-bogglingly a 180 spin that I just had to understand who he was. And I think seeing him progress as a soldier, as someone with talent who was promoted, as someone who was brushed over, the disgruntled side of who he became, the side of, I have all of this potential, but it's not being used, the side of, I have sacrificed in numerous ways for you, but I am not being rewarded. Like, that side takes over, and it's eminently understandable. But it also takes him and the historical period to an incredibly dark place. So there's two stories here. There's a story of an ascent and a desire to kind of want to belong. And then there's a story of kind of complete disillusionment that leads to a kind of nefarious plot to attack the city and unleash, terror on the streets. And if I ever lost track of Alaric in the process of my kind of narrating what happened, I would just usually focus on why he was doing it. And this never comes out in the book, but it was what helped me write it. And that is that it had to have been for his family, for his wife, or for his brother-in-law. The two people we know are with him, only one of whom has a name. We don't know his wife's name at all, but I just can't picture him not coming back into the tent after imperial negotiations break down, after, an attack has gone the wrong way, after he and the Goths have been mocked and turned away from the markets in the town where they're hoping for food. I would always kind of, in my mind, mentally bring it back to him coming back into the tent and just trying to get whatever that emotion was off of his chest, and then wake up the next day and do the next thing. So I hope at the end, that by the time they buried him, I just hoped that I had told his story with some measure of fairness, that I had kind of captured how complicated he was.
Yeah, that's one of the great frustrations of writing history, is knowing. Like, he went back into the tent. That he, said profoundly meaningful things to, or his brother-in-law and his wife, and you can't really know it, and you can't verify it, and so you can't write it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's frustrating. And then I want to double back to your 45 versions of the book. Another frustration is there are things that you labor over, and you just think I'm killing myself over this paragraph, and then in version 36 it gets cut. So what parts did you have to cut out that were painful, and even if it was necessary?
It was the question people often ask is, how do you know when the book is over? How do you know when to end it? And I usually have a fairly good understanding when I start these things of like the scene that I want to end on. But in terms of writing that, like, it could be one paragraph, it could be 5 paragraphs that are associated with that. And this was actually, it's funny, like, this was actually the ending. The ending was like Alaric coming back into the tent, or it was what his relatives thought of him after they'd buried him. What would have been their memory of him, because his memory is what ultimately creates the idea of the Visigoths, is born in everything he did to bring people together. Like, he brought people of numerous ethnicities and cultural backgrounds together, who were Goth, who were Roman, who were any number of ethnicities of the later Roman world, when they realized that they had something more in common than where they had been born or their language. They needed a way to articulate that. Like, the Visigoths don't exist on the map anywhere until after Alaric is dead, because that process of being with him and striving to get recognition for their rights is what created their political community. And it's a big point in history, because it's not as if it's that it changes the whole way you tell the story. It's like there are no Visigoths trying to storm the city and attack it and angry at the borders. Like, these are people whose sense of self comes through hardship, and they embrace this word after their leader dies. And so at the end, I wanted to try to figure out how to put that all into words. And I thought, like, I'll try to say what the brother-in-law thought of his death and what wife thought of his death. And my editor read it, and and she's ruthless, and I love her because she's ruthless. That's actually one of the things that I think makes the relationship work so well. And I'm going to use my prop now. I mean, it was just, I got the pages back because she still writes, she sends corrections in pencil. Like, it was just extraordinary. It's like, I like that New York editor that still works in pencil, and they would just be like, just X's through the last like 5 paragraphs of the book. And I was like, okay, well, that's solves the ending question. Like, we'll just draw a line right here and everything below it will be cut. But I understand what you mean. Like the best part about the revision process was just moving things around. And obviously the hard part to that is like, well, now you've changed the way that they're stitched, the stitching. And so you have to figure out how it gets restitched and attached elsewhere. But no, the like I rarely as a writer overwrite. That's why my books are kind of thin usually. Not thin in substance, but thin in binding. I'm very tight in terms of how I write.
You mentioned stitching it together. I always think a book is like a puzzle. And so you know what the border is, like you've set your parameters, but you have to figure out how the pieces get put together. But I have a friend who says, no, it's like that childhood game Pickup Sticks, where you just dump everything, I don't know if you ever played that, but it's like, foot long toothpicks. You dump them on the table and you have to be very, very careful about picking them up so that and you have to gradually move it around. But the gaming, I guess, of writing is quite a challenge. Like, how do you think about it? Stitching something together, puzzle.
Yeah. Especially with this, because it almost lent itself to puzzling, because like, how, like, where do you find some of the evidence? Like when Alaric is getting ready in 401 AD, he's just been denied promotion. Like, and he's actually, his biggest accomplishment in life, which was being appointed the head of a prefecture from a military outpost. He had an office, like he was one of the big 4. He was like, head honcho. The emperors in 401 decide that their teams are going to redraw the provincial boundaries, and they kind of sketch him out of his job. Like they remove his administration from one side and put it into the other, and as a result, he's looking around, out of a job. And at that point is when he decides he's going to go to Rome for the first time, or he's going to go to Italy for the first time. This is a momentous occasion in the book, because you followed this Goth from border Greece, Constantinople, Balkans. Like at this point, he's at the Alps. Like the story is leading him to this attack. And I wanted to understand what his mentality was, like how he would have decided that enough was enough. So I just like, that doesn't exist. Like no one's interviewing him. So I just went back through the sources and the poetry in particular, because I felt the Romans were always good at poetry, and one of their poets, right in the early 5th century, is writing about how senseless the world can be sometimes, and how we're just constantly sometimes bombarded by choices we have to make, and we never really have a sense that there is any organization happening behind it. Are we here because of God's plan, or are we just atoms in space? And to know that existed in the contemporary poetry record was finding the puzzle piece for describing the 5th century when Alaric made the turn, because I was able to show the reader not what Alaric was thinking, but what Romans thought about making difficult choices. And that's how I did it.
Well, and one of the takeaways I had from the book is not only the Romans are making difficult, sometimes arbitrary choices, but the people on the outside of the empire who are seeking citizenship but being excluded from citizenship, like they have difficult choices and tensions about how to pursue their inclusion.
Totally. And just on this point, and because I know we want to go to some Q&A, maybe like right around now, but like that was one of the most fascinating things in the sources to read, was when the Goths were allowed from the sources to speak, we get this fascinating story of a dinner party of two Goths invited to the imperial palace because they're in the army, and the Goths are there. I mean, an imperial dinner is a state occasion. Everyone is on their best, behavior. The cooks have worked for days to bring everything to the tables during the, especially amongst the principals reclining around. And these two Goths, we hear from the sources, have gotten into an argument. And they've gotten into an argument with themselves about whether Rome is working fast enough to solve their people's problems, or whether someone needs to kind of do something radical to inspire change. And one of them says, look, Rome hasn't been good to us so far. They've invited us in. They've given us some land. We need to be patient with how, with whether they can address our issues. Like, Goths can be sold into slavery at the drop of a hat because they have no citizenship rights. So, and the other Goth at this point in the middle of dinner, the wine had been flowing freely. And he says, this is absurd that we keep having to bear the brunt of their inaction. They won't address the inherent inequality in our status versus their civic status. Why are we pretending that they're going to get to this anytime soon? And the two Goths wind up in a fight, and one of them pulls out a sword and stabs the other one at the middle of the imperial dinner party. And the emperor watches it happen, and the emperor sees the victor and just kind of gives this kind of cool, chilly look and says, you're going to go far, as he stands over as the slaves, clean up the bloodbath at of the internal disagreement over how to respond to Roman action. The choices that the Goths made were incredibly difficult.
Well, that is an excellent place to turn. Because I think that story captures both the complexity of the story you're telling, and also just that it's a really gripping story, beautifully told. So that was a good example.
Lorri, thank you for doing this with me. It's so fun to talk to you about this. You make it very easy.
It was great.
Okay, so I'm gonna start with one of my questions that's been kind of burning in my head through this entire event. But is there, and forgive me if there's no connection, but is there a connection between the Goths, the Visigoths, and like Gothic architecture, Gothic literature, even the Goths, like from like the 80s, 90s, like from my period in time, are those connected, like either like linguistically or like by some sort of cultural thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the natural question to ask, and I'm thrilled that you did, because it allows me to say that there's a Spotify playlist for my book, which is all 80s post-punk, music inspired by, The Cure and Susie and the Banshees. Like it's all there. Helped me while I was writing and getting in the mood. But the label, by the Middle Ages, so 300, 400 years after Alaric's attack, it becomes this slur. It becomes this thing that mostly through architecture, like when the architectural currents of Northern Europe, like France and whatnot, started to experiment with architecture that didn't look classical. So it doesn't have the kind of rigid, robust columns or the kind of heavy pediments of a classical temple. And people started to experiment with glass and flying buttresses that could kind of make the walls go bigger and prop everything up to make the interior more illuminated. The architectural critics of the Middle Ages thought it was so barbaric and not Roman that they called it Gothic. And kind of in the classic history of slurs that get appropriated, Gothic eventually became appropriated as something that people were proud of. So that by 1492, and this is probably the last date that I mentioned in the book, by the time of 1492, when the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria are getting ready to launch across the Atlantic, everyone is wishing those explorers and daredevils and adventurers to bring the Gothic ideals to the other side of the globe, because to be someone who takes risks at that point had become associated with what it meant to take the risks that the architects had, and that by extension Alaric and his people had. So the legacy is there, all wrapped up in kind of the ups and downs of how the architecture is received, and then ultimately appropriated for the idea of just anyone that is really not conformist and takes the initiative to just go on an adventure.
Thank you. That's enlightening. All right, so now an audience question, since that was my burning question. But
you get the right. You get the right for the first question.
Kirsten is asking 2 questions. Do you see the future of the U.S. following a similar path as the Roman Empire? I see a lot of similarities between Rome and the U.S. when it comes to xenophobia and immigrant labor. However, it seems as if the Romans relied on foreign labor and didn't mind it as much, but our current president is pushing the America First policy and having our goods manufactured in the U.S. And that's the first question. I'll let you answer that one, and then we'll get to the second one.
So I think, Kirsten, it's such a fascinating question, because when Alaric kind of raised these issues of inclusiveness and political protection, would the Goths have the same level of equality that the Romans who had been born with citizenship did? When he raised this issue, the Roman response in his generation and for generations to come was no. And it's not as if Alaric was the only person to kind of cause a problem for the Romans on this point of how to include outsiders, how to bring outsiders into the political state. It happened repeatedly in the 5th century, and the empire eventually fell apart, fell apart, because it was easier for the Romans to just not address it than to was easier for the Romans to break up as an entity than address this, what should have been a kind of basic civic institution. So I look back at that and compare it to today, and I think in terms of, my ideals are hopeful, where the Romans' values were kind of misplaced in kind of hopelessness. I look around and I see statues coming down that are way past their expiration date, and I see a space for new artists to create a new sense of what it means to be a part of a local national community. And that sense of where we're turning, of how exciting it's going to be to watch that happen. Kehinde Wiley is the first, but he's not the last. To create those new spaces and to create that sense of belongingness way out surpasses anything that the Romans articulated when Alaric attacked, and in the light of his attack. They chose to do nothing. And I don't think our political will is that fatalistic.
And the second question, why do you think Alaric still had admiration for the Roman Empire, even though he and the other Goths were constantly being mistreated?
It's a fantastic question. I mean, it gets absolutely at the crux of why I think I wanted to tell his story, which is it's very easy to hear about what he did and to assume that he should just go start his own country someplace else. I think you can get into the medieval period and just find books that just assume that the Goths had to kind of form their own entity, in southern France in the 5th century, because there was just there was no way for them to exist as part of the Roman state. And everything about his life is about wanting to be included. And the Romans say this in the sources, they're impressed by, he strikes them as more Roman at times than Gothic, which, is a way of kind of saying he's out Romaning many of the Roman citizens. He had to have, I think, at his core, just a desire for respecting the way complexity comes together, and he found an audience of people who were just insistent that he couldn't belong. But I don't think that he ever gave up that dream.
My next question is going to be for both of you. So I'm assuming that you do a great deal of research just in general. When you're not doing research specifically for a book that you're working on,
I'm going to see if this changes the dynamic. Keep going.
When do you find that person in your research, or how do you know when you find that person that this is the person that I'm going to write my next book about?
I want to hear what Lorri says first.
So the reason about Eliza is kind of more passive than some other things I've written about. About 6 years ago, there was a new digital project compiling the letters of Eliza Luke and her daughter Harriet Pinckney Ory, and the two of them wrote, hundreds and hundreds of letters that were preserved from the early 18th century forward. They kept cookbooks and travel logs and just every kind of written record you can imagine they preserved. And then a scholar at the University of South Carolina named Connie Scholes had a team, and they created this digital edition. And I was writing about something else entirely, but the editor of a journal asked me if I would review the project. And I loved it. It was great fun to explore it and to meet two fascinating women. And so at the very end of the review, I thought, this is going to open this is opportunities for scholars to write about and, women. And so then when I finished the project I was working on, I tried out 2 or 3 different ideas, and Eliza was still with me. And so I just stuck with her.
I'm navigating the ray of light coming down on my head now. I mean, I like hearing that, Lorri, because it's, you kind of like, I don't know, one project always kind of extends from another project for me. Never know, like you put a little note aside and be like, oh, that could be, you kind of have to start thinking in terms of books, right? It's like, that could be a book. And I had just finished a textbook on this period. If anyone's looking for the sawdust dry version of the end of the Roman Empire, like I have something I can recommend you to read. But this was, I don't know. There, like you start to kind of think in terms of like that could be a good book, but then you also start to think of books that it's like, or and I don't want to mention them because I don't want it to, those are kind of private choices that motivate. I think a good, a writer needs those inspirations that he keeps to himself. But I think I was inspired by people who had not had their stories fully told, or in addition to people whose lives were almost completely hidden, that needed to be told through context. And when I found that there are models for how to do this, then it became easy to conceive of Alaric as a subject, because I had help, I had creative help in terms of just seeing how other people did it. But I would not have gotten there had I not left my field. I'm an evangelist for that. I'm a classicist by training, but I don't really read classics literature. It's I would rather read what's happening in a different part of the globe, or a novel on a completely different topic, that because it's important for those issues of representation. Like, I'm not going to find a story about, like the issues of race in antiquity are strained theoretically, like how, you can't quite access those struggles or those ideals before the modern era, because the languages is not there. So I have to read, and I do read voluminously, simply to keep my sense of like compass for what stories people want. And then then I go back to the material I know.
I think that
I also think, I mean, both Doug and I are historians, but we're also writers, and we both like to write different kinds of history books. So we've both done a textbook, we've done traditional, monographic scholarly work. And I really wanted to write a biography. I thought that would be a really challenging and different form. And I found it extremely difficult and rewarding in equal measures.
Totally. Yeah, it's my first attempt at a biography. I'm sure some people say like, well, it was a brave attempt. It may not be the most sad. Like, I think one of my friends, like she she's a really good friend. She accosted me. She's like, he doesn't show up until page 103. Like, it was that level of like indignation. Like, where is this main character? And I said, well, we the marketing picked the title. And but I mean, that challenge of capturing one person's life was totally a product of, like Lorri was saying, that's what writers do. There's only set number of formulas for the types of books there are, but there are spun into many different original manifestations. And this seemed like the right time for me to introduce readers to a very difficult world, completely unjust, completely unfair, rabidly xenophobic world, through one person's attempt to make a life during it. And that's what he has to tell us about today, I think, which is at some point he did not want to keep trying.
Thank you, because I think it's incredibly important to tell stories about history that aren't about the victors or the people who have told history for so many years. So it's really refreshing to have a book like yours. So I want to thank both of you for doing this event. It has really been enlightening and quite a pleasure. And I want to remind everyone that the books, both authors, both Douglas Boin and Lorri Glover, have books available for sale at left-bank.com, or you can give us a call if you really want to hear someone's voice. We will pick up the call between 10 and 6 Monday through Saturday and 11 to 6 on Sundays. And thank you, audience, for joining us, and thank you both of you for having this incredible conversation.
I just need to give a shout out to my mom in case she's in the audience. I didn't do it last time, and I got hurt. Couldn't live it down. So I know I can't see anyone who's in the audience, but Mom, if you're there, I just want to give you a hi.
Is your mom Joyce? Is your mom Joyce?
It is. She is. Yeah.
She commented.
She's there. Yes. Hi, Doug's mom. He's fantastic.
All right. Well, I think we will sign
Thank
off.
you so much for hosting this.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you, both of you.
Absolutely. And we will see everyone next time.